So a very warm welcome to Jarno Rantaharju, who's here from the Swansea Academy of Advanced Computing to talk about open source licenses.
Thanks. So essentially, what I have done for this talk is, because I didn't know essentially anything about the basic licenses except which one I should use, told to me by someone else for one particular project. I think that's basically where many people are in this about this topic. I wanted somebody to give a talk about open source licenses, so that I would find out just some basics about all the possibilities out there, and then I just for some reason volunteered to give a talk. So after some Googling, I have some basic things to say about open source, about the licenses out there. Now, first, it of course matters why you're publishing your code. So it's good to think about why you should, first of all, why you should publish your code, and then what it is that you want to actually achieve from publishing it. Because that's going to affect which license you want to use. So, of course, your code, if it's a scientific code, it is a scientific result on its own, in its own right. It's also a part of the data if you're publishing research, and you're supposed to publish the data at the same time, which happens to a varying degree, but you should also publish your code at the same time, because it is not just the way you come to the data, it is actually a part of the process of the research that you are making public. Publishing your code, of course, makes your research reproducible. Somebody else can run it later. And especially in HPC-heavy fields, wait 10 years, 20 years, and a lot of people can reproduce your research, even if it's not really possible right now. Okay? It facilitates research in your field, which is a nice way of saying you get more citations. Of course, getting ahead in helping people to get ahead in your field is what you want to do if you are actually a researcher that's doing the work because you want to find things out, right? So when you enable others to use your code to get results, you enable yourself to find out things faster, right? And of course, then in many cases, the journal starts to require you to publish a source, and then you have to, or your funding source, or your university, at some point requires you to publish your source code. And at that point, at the latest, you want to think about how you're actually going to achieve that. Now, there are several kinds of open source licenses, and there's actually, of course, they vary on many axes, right? The simplest option, or the simplest license, is the public domain declaration. Essentially, that means that you just let anybody use it. You retain the copyright so that nobody else can copyright the code that you wrote, but you let anybody use it in any way. Okay? That's the least restrictive possibility. There's also other open source licenses. In principle, this is an open source program. There's more permissive ones, like the MIT, Apache, and so on. And then there's the way of using copyleft licenses, which are more restricted, so GNU licenses, for example. There's this sort of dichotomy between copyright in the sense of keeping the rights to yourself and giving as little or giving little actual license to people getting your code. Right? And then there's the copyleft, where the idea is that your code and any modifications to it should be public and usable by anybody. And in between those, many people put sort of center between copyright and copyleft, they put the permissive ones, which actually give lots of permissions to users, don't restrict them, but also usually require that that they acknowledge your work. So you can think of it as sort of a two-dimensional graph also. Then you have this, like the political horseshoe thing, where there's the left and the right, and then there's sort of authoritarian and less authoritarian, in this case permissive and restrictive. Copyleft and copyright are both restrictive, and permissive licenses, of course, are not restrictive, so they are on different axes.
If you wanted to ask Richard Stallman's opinion on this, he would claim that it's more a matter of who you're being permissive to. So whether you're being permissive to people who want to use the software or people who want to develop the software.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. So when I say permissive, you're giving more permissions to people developing the software rather than the potential users.
On some level, but you're also then preventing people who would want to develop the software that's being developed. So you're not maximising the developer base of the software in some senses.
Well, depends.
It's kind of awkward semantics
that
lots of people like to start arguments about, and probably I shouldn't.
Okay. Well, I mean, the permissive license gives essentially, permissive licenses tend to give any potential developers permission to use the code to develop it, and do not require necessarily that they publish it, so that other developers may not be able to extend on that work. So
you're giving permission to be less permissive.
Yeah. And so there is a conversation, of course, going on all the time on whether which is better for getting other people to work on your code. You might think that giving more permissions to developers would give them more incentive to develop on your code. But of course, if they don't have to publish their changes, that might not help other developers as much. Okay. Now, of course, one option is there's copyleft. Copyright is the other direction. So you can publish your code on a license that's not actually considered an open source license. Right? You can keep the permissions for yourself and just publish your code. That's an option.
That was something Microsoft did back in the early 2000s. They had their shared source program, and they made the full source code for Windows and Microsoft Office available to selected partners under a very, very restricted license.
Actually, if you try to find some standard copyright but open source licenses, what you find is these Microsoft shared source licenses. So then, between copyleft licenses and copyright licenses, well, anyway, not very great terminology there, but you can also do multi-licensing. So of course you can publish your code with some restrictions or publish parts of your code, but as long as you hold the copyright, you can also license it and sell it under other licenses. And of course then one option is to just use no license, but nevertheless you can publish your code. So you don't have to use a license. And that means that nobody has any permission to do anything, essentially. So I'll go through some of the more popular ones, sort of starting from the less restrictive end and ending up to the more restrictive end. So the unlicensed declaration is essentially the least restrictive possible. You might debate this. I'll come to this. Because it is also the shortest and simplest possible text, licensed text available, right? It essentially, it states that you give the source, you give your work to the public domain. It has no requirements, no conditions on using the code, publishing the code, and so on. It gives some, the unlicensed specifically, gives some list of permissions, but it also tries to make it clear that this is actually a declaration that this is a public domain work. It does limit. It mentions limitations. So there's liability and warranty. Essentially, that means that you're not giving any warranty. You're not liable for anything that people do with the code, wherever that's possible in the legal system. But essentially the idea is that whoever receives the code can do anything they want, as long as they don't try to copyright it for themselves. Here's the text. You see, the dark background is maybe not the best possible. And of course, you can go to unlicensed.org to find out a bit more. It's a very short text, but it does it gives a list of things you can do. You can copy, modify, publish, use, compile, sell, or distribute either source code or compiled binary for any purpose, commercial or non-commercial, or by any means. That sounds pretty much like you can do anything you want. But there's no mention of patents, for example. There's no mention of trademarks. Trademarks is an important point because they are not essentially they're usually a different system from copyrights. And therefore, this license may not actually change the state of trademarks. And some businesses would be hesitant to start using this code because there's no explicit grant of patent rights. That depends, of course, on the jurisdiction. Now, the next is the MIT license, which is almost the same thing, except that it requires you to keep the copyright and license notice with the source code when you use it, when you distribute it. So when you take a chunk of a MIT license code, you have to keep the copyright notice. Right? That doesn't mean that you have to use the same license, which is really the hallmark of the MIT license. Right? You don't have to publish anything under the same license, even if you use part of something under the MIT license. You just have to keep the copyright notification. So otherwise this is basically the same. So you put your name there, you put a year, and it will hang around on anywhere where your code is being used. And maybe even sometimes people will see the copyright notice and notice that your name is there. But otherwise it gives a bit less freedom. You can copy software, deal without restrictions, including without limitation of right to use, copy, modify, merge, publish, distribute, sub-license, or sell copies of the software. So more or less anything you want. But again, there's nothing about patents here. And there's a restriction on warranty and liability. Okay. Then there's the Apache license, which answers the patent thing. So the Apache license is, again, pretty similar. Actually, is that right? I've written state changes here. So you have to mention what has been changed in your version of the code compared to the version you got. You have to make some sort of a list of the changes you've done. The other thing is, it explicitly states that you can use the software in something that you patent. And you cannot use any trademarks associated with the code. So now these things are getting pretty long at this point. But there's the patent part is here, which essentially just means that anybody receiving this code can patent anything that uses this code. Given that nobody else has patented it yet.
Isn't it the other way around? That if you've patented something and you release the code under this license, then you cannot claim patent rights against the person using the code?
That also sounds correct.
Okay.
Let's just see. Patent license to make, have made, use, offer to sell, in product, blah blah blah. License applies to only those patent claims licensable by such contributors that are necessarily infringed by their contributions. So you will not break any patterns by using this code, essentially. Okay. Yes. And there is a restriction on copyright somewhere in here. I guess you believe me about that.
Well, that's how all these licenses work, is via copyright.
Yeah.
If it's not copyright, you have no rights to impose any restrictions at all.
Well, yeah.
So that's
yeah, so this is specifically saying that you are not allowed to use any trademark names associated with the code. So if you take the Apache source code, the Apache server source code, and you try to publish it and call it the Apache server, then you are actually in conflict with the license. Okay, they're going to a bit more restrictive, but there's actually, no, the lesser GPL license has something about patents in it. Version 3 is where the patent thing comes in. So GNU licenses are now, they are sort of traditional copyleft licenses, which means essentially in this case that you have to use the same license that the software is published under. So if you publish something using GPL license, everybody using your code has to publish their changes under the same license. Now, the lesser part means, there are just in GNU licenses or copyleft licenses in general, you have these conditions, essentially. So you have to disclose the source. Whenever you use this software distribute this software for any purpose, you have to give the source code. Now, the way you do it doesn't have to be on the same download as the software you're distributing, but it has to be available somewhere. It has to be clear where to find it. The other thing, you have to keep the license copyright notice, same as the other ones. It has to be, any changes have to be under the same license. That's a big thing. That takes you to the copyleft world. And you have to state what changes you have made. You can use it in commercial applications. You can distribute, modify, you can patent things, you can use the code nevertheless. And of course you can use it for private purposes, and in that case, in principle, you don't have to disclose the source because you're not disclosing anything with anybody. And again, the same limitations, liability and warranty. Now, the lesser part essentially means that you can, if what you're publishing is a library, people can link against your library without publishing their code under the same license. Right? So if you're linking against a library published under the lesser GPL, you don't have to care about these conditions. Most Linux, most GNU Linux libraries are published under the lesser GPL, so you're fine. And I think I have the source here as well. I think you can find it through Google. There's also the web page somewhere here. I didn't make a separate list of all the sources that I used. But it's getting pretty big. I don't want to go through everything.
So this is linking. So this is explicitly in the language when you have some. But for example, if you have a different, this linking principle works even for Python or for other kind of languages which have different.
I think.
So I mean, Python.
It's not quite clear. Linking comes from the concept really comes from compiled languages where you I would assume that the same restrictions would apply.
I've seen definitions that involve like the executable code occupying the same virtual address space. So when you load a module in CPython, then that will load, or even a module in Python, that will load, they have access to the same memory.
Mm-hmm.
they can share objects, and then that's linking.
This is actually
Yes, that makes sense. Okay.
this is not actually a perfectly clear thing legally speaking. For example, there is still an ongoing conversation about whether static linking actually is linking in the same way as whether dynamic linking is the same thing, is linking in the same sense as static linking. Because in static linking, you're compiling everything in the same object, so you're actually taking the whole library and putting it inside your object, right? Whereas static linking means that it's not actually in the same file.
Dynamic linking.
Dynamic. That's okay. Static linking means that they're in the same file. Dynamic linking means that they're not.
But also dynamic linking.
So it's not clear if dynamic linking counts.
Well, dynamic linking is also something that happens, on a machine of the user. So actually, the person who writes the code has no control over that. Could be that the same library. If you have injection or
Somebody, if you write an interface that's clearly intended to use a library published on this, I think in most cases they would the GPL, that's the licensing pool. Well, the people who wrote this license claim that if you write the software intending to link against a GNU library, and if it's not under the lesser license, you are actually you would be infringing on the license.
That's really interesting, because there was a US court case last year, or at least the latest chapter in a US court case about whether or not interfaces are copyrightable. So whether or not you can take an API and copyright it. And it's come out that in the US, yes, APIs are copyrightable. You cannot go and re-implement someone else's API.
Okay.
But the Free Software Foundation in that case were very much against that. They were, no, you should be able to re-implement other people's interfaces to do a clean room re-implementation of a compatible version of the same library effectively under a different license. But
that's interesting.
If you believe what they're saying there,
yeah, in this case, and this is just from Wikipedia, it might be old information, but I think in this case they actually go to they seem to have the opposite opinion.
Yeah.
So that writing an interface or using an interface written for a new library and actually intending to use that library means that you have to use the GNU license.
Yeah.
Except that almost all the libraries are actually published under the lesser GPL license, which means that you don't. So just if it uses the lesser license, you don't have to think about it. If it uses the normal license, I just wouldn't go there. I don't have the lawyers, so.
But you've got to use FFTW. Let's talk about FFTW later.
Okay. So Gnu Gpl, of course, is the next, more restrictive version. Everything is the same except that this. Actually, I'm not sure about this. I have the text here. I'm not sure if there's actually an explicit mention about libraries or not. But the interpretation is that you cannot link against a library published on this without publishing your code under the same license. So all the conditions apply if you link against a library in this case. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same. Let's just see. Whose source is excluded from the corresponding source as the system library need not be included. That's interesting.
I think the problem there is that we're not lawyers, and this document is designed to be read by lawyers.
Yeah. Yeah. Unlike the MIT license, this is starting to get complicated.
You can tell because it has a preamble.
Yeah. there's only 2 mentions of the word library on this page. If you don't mind. So this is quite different, but I can't pass it. Even more restrictive, just for completeness. There is also the Gnu Gpl license. Gnu Gpl. Just Gnu twice there, I guess. No, it's a general public license. Right. Again, it essentially the same conditions, permissions, and limitations. But in this case, providing a service over the internet using the software is considered distribution. So you have to fulfill the license conditions if you provide a service using the software. Okay, this is probably not going to be very important to most researchers unless they run into something using this license. But in principle, you can use this license and therefore limit anybody else from using your software, even to provide a service.
Yeah, no, I think that's relevant. If researchers were releasing their software and their software was something that someone could modify and turn into a Web 2.0 startup.
Yeah,
Like
true.
I've got some engineering software that does some calculations. I'm going to provide that service over the internet using someone else's software that they obviously wanted to be distributed, but I'm not going to distribute it because I don't have to, because I'm just using it on the website.
Yeah, that's essentially the point of this license. It essentially prohibits, it doesn't actually prohibit, because they can provide the service as long as they publish the source and fulfill all the conditions, right? Which, it still makes sense, because you're still providing a service. But you cannot do modifications, not publish those modifications and provide a service.
You can't use it to provide vendor lock-in.
So then if you use this license, you can then sell a less restrictive license to somebody to use your software, for example. Or you can patent it and use it on your own. Okay. And there's another long text file that I'm not going to go too much into detail with. But the most restrictive option, of course, is no license at all. There's no text file for this. It just means that you publish your code on any platform and you do not explicitly provide any license. That means that nobody has any permission in principle to do anything except view the source in the way that you have provided it, right? At least I'm being maybe a bit more restrictive than might be possible in some jurisdictions, but I'm not going to say anything else about that. Okay. Essentially, that means that everybody who wants to use the source code for something has to ask you for permission every time, for every purpose. And you can grant that permission. You can grant the license, right? That's fine. If you put it on GitHub, you do give some permissions, because the GitHub user, the terms and conditions of GitHub, for example, and GitLab I think has the same, state that any user can view and fork, which is actually to create a copy on their own account, but not on their home computer. So they cannot pull, but they can fork. Okay? You can give permission to pull.
Is it possible to have a repo on GitHub that unlogged in users are not allowed to clone?
Technically they can clone in the same way as usual, but you have not explicitly given permission to do that.
Okay.
If you publish it without a license, my understanding at this point is that cloning to your own computer is not covered by the terms and conditions. Right. Okay. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
But for some reason you can create a fork, which helps you in no way whatsoever. So you have your own copy, but that's it.
It helps GitHub, doesn't it? I mean, if a user of GitHub hits the clone button to download, that's on them. But if they hit fork, then GitHub does some work, and GitHub would be liable for that fork. So they have to give permission to GitHub to fork, otherwise. GitHub and have to change their software to make life working.
Yeah.
Got that.
Yes.
But I mean, well, yeah, it's not their software that does the download if you're cloning.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Well, the other common situation where you have no license is when people say on paper that at the end of the paper, just write this email address if you want to see the source code, and they actually reply and send you the source code, which apparently happens sometimes. In that case, you have no license to do anything that they didn't actually tell you you can do, in principle. So you can view the source code.
You can do anything that doesn't involve taking a copy. So you can presumably compile it and run it.
Well, most of the licenses actually explicitly tell you that you can compile. So I'm not sure if that's true in all jurisdictions.
It would have been fun though if I could send you a piece of software and you are not allowed to open the attachment because I haven't given you permission to download the
Well, I mean, if you
opening the attachment.
if you write to someone and say, I would like to see the source code, can you send it to me? And they send it to you, then you can see the source code.
Implicit grant of license. Yeah.
It's an implicit grant of a license to view. Also, publishing it on a web page is an implicit grant of license to view.
Unless you publish that, you give an encrypted version for public. You allow that people to publicly download that and then provide keys.
Sell keys to someone.
Would that be considered an implicit license to read the source code when its public key cryptography is broken?
If you do it before it's broken, I would think not. I don't know. You're probably dead at that point.
Quantum computing is coming quickly.
Sure, but
Yeah.
just use a quantum computing safe encryption.
Oh yeah. Oh sure, at that point, yeah.
So those exist.
Yeah.
Yeah, and by your choice of not using a quantum computing safe algorithm, then you're implicitly allowing it.
Yeah, okay, this is up to the legal experts probably,
Yes.
but I would say that at that point, yeah, why not? Okay, yeah. So what was I thinking? That's one more thing. Yeah, okay, so these are the commonly used licenses. But in principle, there's nothing that prevents you, for example, from publishing your source code with a slightly modified MIT license, for example, that says that you're not allowed to publish articles in research publications without your permission or without citing this paper or something like that. It's actually interesting that I didn't find one of those commonly used, because I would think citing this paper would be a relatively common thing that you would want.
Is there something legally about whether you're allowed to change the license text without either renaming the license or putting some sort of notice that you have changed it? Like, can I put it up and call it the MIT license and change
I think the
content
MIT
slightly?
license is a trademark, and they have not given you permission to use their trademark, except for the purpose of having that specific license. But of course, you could call it your own. You could call
Yeah, no, sure, I can call it
the
Jarno's license.
research citation license or the cite this license.
No, sure, but you can't be sneaky and like put up something and people are like, yeah, it's the MIT license. I know it's not the case, I'm not going to read it. And
That would be a very
something there.
clear. That would very clearly break the trademark rules, because then you would be obviously trying to use a trademark to fool people into thinking that you're giving them something that they're not giving them. But yeah. Okay, I already mentioned multi-licensing. Essentially, this is I already said everything that's here, but I mean, of course you can. If you own the copyright, that's the point essentially that I should make at this point in the presentation. If you own the copyright, you are free to publish it under as many licenses as possible, right? As you want. So you can sell different licenses and you can publish it under a copyleft license. You can even publish it under an MIT license and sell the license for a compiled binary if somebody's willing to pay you for that at that point. Yeah.
Oh, and then we're in the question of whether can I than sell someone a version compiled with a modern Intel compiler to someone who can't afford the price of the Intel compiler.
Yeah, I have deliberately not talked about code generated by someone else's program. I didn't find really anything about that. I spent maybe an hour looking, but still.
Because that's technically
that's an interesting question.
Has value.
Yeah. Especially once you start writing some optimization, machine learning optimization algorithm to change your assembly code, which is happening. If the program you're using is not open source, do you have the copyright to the result? Or on the other hand, if the program you're using is GPL, do you have to publish the result under GPL? I would think not in that case, but I don't know. Okay. Anyway, now there's an important restriction, of course, in this case. So if you want to dual license something, and you want to use open source licenses to encourage other people to develop your code, which is one of the main reasons people actually use those licenses. I mean, other than just wanting to actually do something good for the community and to further the research field. In this case, you need to think about other copyright holders. So either you have to ask their permission to publish your code on a different license. So essentially, you have something called a contributor license agreement, which states that any contribution you make means that you're giving the copyright to me to publish the code in any way I want. Or it could be less restrictive. It could just say that you give me the permission to publish this under MIT or GNU licenses or something like that. Or GPL licenses. You also need the permission to change that license, basically in principle. Unless you're going from a less restrictive GPL license to a more restrictive GPL license, or MIT to GPL license. But in many cases, you do need permission from the other contributors to do things to your own software. Okay, so that's all I found out so far. Thanks for your attention.